camera on this laptop. So I went in about 10 minutes ago, all set up, and it's like, you've signed in from another location.
Yeah.
This password to that, and
yeah.
so I was.
Welcome to my job when you end up teaching on Zoom or through Teams.
Yeah,
Teams is my least favorite thing to ever do now.
It is a nightmare because you just think, when you don't have time to.
Yeah.
But
It's harder to actually even, I don't know, focus on what you're doing. So that's when I end up pressing the wrong button and things like that. So,
well, thankfully, I something flashed on my phone saying you've signed in from an unsecured location. So
am I insecure?
No, not that. But I mean, from this,
you're insecure, and I'm insecure.
I think we're all
Russians are coming.
It's part of the human condition, but yeah. But anyway, for those watching, we've apologies for the lateness, but we've finally managed to sort this out, and we've got a broadcast. If you all just bear with me a few seconds, because I need to do some very quick technical tidying, and then hopefully all will be well. So yes, I mean, let's start with Putin's People.
Yeah.
We're reviewing 2 books this evening. Putin's People by Catherine Belton, Never a Dull Moment, which is a new biography of King George V by Jane Ridley. So for just briefly, as a start, what attracted you to this book?
Well, it's one of those books that's been on my list of books I must read for ages, because I watched the series that was on a few years ago on the BBC about Putin and or Putin, as we're meant to call him now, for more reasons than one. And he struck me as being a terrifying character, and somebody who had gained a lot of power almost by stealth, and had gained a lot of control in the West by stealth, both of our political systems and also of our financial systems, and in part through social media. And obviously with what's going on in Ukraine now, I felt I really had to read it. So that's what brought me to it. And it's an amazing book. Catherine Belton is, pardon the pun, a belting journalist. I mean, she really is an extreme. I mean, she's a former FT business journalist. I don't know if she's still there actually, but she's an FT business journalist. And I've worked for the FT myself, and I know that they fact check everything. This is not the sort of journalism where people slap claims on the page and it doesn't matter. They really care about what they're saying, and they develop very, very good contacts. And the contacts she uses, they are insiders within, sorry, that's my dog making strange noises. She's talking to insiders within the former KGB. She's talking to insiders within the Russian government, the Moscow regime. She's talking to former diplomats. She's talking to business people. Her network of contacts is fantastic, and it does read like a Le Carre novel. And I'm a huge Le Carre fan, and it does read like that. So it's that moment when you think truth is stranger than fiction. And what it's made me do is realize how what we're seeing now isn't an accident. This has been a long going plan. And the complacency or the naivety or the laziness, I can't work out which one, of Western governments, the arrogance. I think part of it is arrogance. It was, was it Francis Fukuyama's idea of the end of history, and everything's worked out fine, so we should all feel fine now.
Yes.
It really worries. I mean, we've allowed this to happen and to creep up on us.
There is it does remind me of oh, what was I going to say? Of two things. One, that it reminds me of the 1990s when it is, and I remember thinking, with all the naivety of a teenager, but one who obviously through GCSE history had read a bit about Russian history as historical events in Russia were unfolding, and thinking, oh, thank God Russia's problems are all over. Now they've
I remember the same.
Yeah, now they've
we all suddenly thought, oh, it's the end, the Cold War is over. And I'm teaching history to secondary students who've all been very worried about this. But some of the history I teach is about the Cold War. Some of it, I'm just starting on the American Civil Rights Movement with my year nines. So, 14-year-olds. And I was talking to them about how fearful we felt growing up with the threat of nuclear war in the Cold War, how that was a constant fear that we had, that this wasn't just something that was imaginary. It was something that was actual. It was an actual fear. Mutually aided destruction was real. The idea and the concepts that kept peace were truly terrifying, and they were just like, no, it's never been a problem. And because it's hard to imagine unless you're facing it.
Well, I mean, it's I remember once I was reminded of this recently when I saw when I remembered listening to, I think it was John Lennon's last ever interview just hours before he was killed, or either that or the BBC one he did 2 days before, one of his very last interviews, and where he obviously was talking about at one point mentioned the shadow of the bomb, and he said, I remember hearing him say, I don't think it's going to happen. I really don't think it's going to happen. And I'm listening to this with the cozy post-war thing, thinking, oh, he was right on that one.
And how we learned.
In recent weeks, it's come into my mind, and it's like I've had the kind of, it's not a constant fear. I've never been actively fearful of it because it's not something I think you can control over. But it's obviously a fear in the very back of my mind, and it's a fear I have not had since I was a teenager.
Yeah, it's an underlying anxiety, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's one of those things. I can remember us watching, the Protect and Survive and being told to hide under your desk or build a bomb shelter through your, with your, doors from your house and things. And it all seemed a bit ludicrous, but it also felt like it was something quite real. And I had friends who went off to Greenham. I was old enough to have friends who ran off in their teens to Greenham, and so it felt like it molded our political thinking. It molded our understanding of geopolitics.
Yes,
I remember also being very interested and supporting the campaigns of the Jewish people in not Stalinist Russia, because I'm not that old, but in 1980s Russia, because I had a teacher who was Jewish, our PE teacher, and we had some lessons on Israel and things. And I remember at the time, wanting to support oppressed Jewish people in Russia and being part of the campaigns and writing letters and things like that then. So, it was real. It was a call to action.
Yes.
But it was more of an underlying anxiety that you only realised was gone
when it was all over.
The wall fell. When it was all over, as you say. And that fear is coming back. Seeing what's happening. And what I love about this book is the way, I mean, she's meticulous in her research, And lots of people have talked about Putin being this thug who, you know, was a street fighter, and that's the mythology around him, that he's a bit of a tough guy. But what she does is really show how he worked his way through the KGB, how he was almost implanted to take the position he's got now. So he's not somebody who just accidentally fell into the presidency, which I think some people felt he was the accidental prime minister under Yeltsin. No. But he was carefully positioned, and the way that the KGB worked towards its own survival, and the way that they were, you know, they could see the end was coming, but they set up enough you know, operations, be they through business, be they through the most incredible understanding of money laundering and, you know, compromat, you know, the whole idea of compromising business leaders and politicians. They set this all up so that they would survive. And they had this huge funding, which they still have. Even though it's not formally the KGB now, but this is where it's come from. And the book even talks about the way that you know, Putin and the other, you know, former KGB agents, their idea and their ideal of the greater Russia, the Russian, you know, imperial Soviet Russia, which was an imperial nation, and its eyes on Ukraine and how it felt about the revolutions in Ukraine and in Georgia and attempted changes there. And this idea of these, of it having a much bigger place, a much bigger geographical place that takes in all of these, you know, all of these Baltic states as well. And she talks about that, and it's frightening because it feels prophetic reading it now.
One of the things that's crossed my mind, I think it's crossed a lot of people's mind, that I want to touch on is remembering what I was taught about the 1930s. Are there parallels with the 1930s in how Putin saw Russia and how Hitler saw Germany in the book at all?
She doesn't talk about that in the same way. No, I mean, even though we can see that now, what she talks about is this fear of the West and this sense that the West is after it, you know, this complete hatred and distrust of NATO and the idea, and so which you can see. But she's not talking, she doesn't talk about it in the way you're describing. I mean, she's not, because it was written, you know, a couple of years ago, this is why it feels prophetic. But I'm always a bit wary, as a historian, I'm always a little bit wary of drawing parallels with past times. But certainly Putin shares that idea of, you know, the Ein Volk, you know, the one, you know, he shares that idea of this one Russian people, and he's got this mythology that he believes about Kiev being the birthplace of Russia, and therefore it is integral to the Russian nation, the Russian territorial nation, even though it's quite a different culture.
This might seem a bit of a strange question, but has the book given you any hope?
Oh,
as in how things might play out that's positive?
I don't feel that hopeful, unless the only way I feel hopeful is if we challenge this. You know, she's a business journalist, and you know, Catherine Belton, as I say, she's done a brilliant job, but she's done the classic thing of following the money. And as a former journalist myself, I've always said, you follow the money, you follow the facts, you follow the money. And my only hope from this is by having books like this, having journalists like Carol Cadwalladr, who's done such incredible work and has stood up and has suffered the most appalling slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, in terms of having to deal with libel threats. And with people like Cohen as well, who wrote a column about this a couple of weeks ago, where he was talking about the way the law courts are used in this country to silence journalists. And Catherine Belton has had to face some of this. Hob Collins and her were sued by, I can't remember which, oligarch, but they've had to face legal challenges from, that are managed by British legal teams. So my only hope is the fact that these words are getting out there. And now people are looking at what's happening in Ukraine, and the shock and terror of what's happening is making people suddenly go, God, this shouldn't have happened. But when you see, the likes, and she talks about this about, Trump taking, having flats paid for in cash and all of these dodgy, clearly money laundering deals, whether Trump knew about them or not, I'm not saying that, obviously I can't say that, but the fact that it's 101 for money laundering, paying in cash, 4 million quid for an apartment in London.
No questions asked. Yeah.
Nobody asking any questions. They're just thinking, oh, it's putting up the prices. And you just have to wonder now how deeply embedded it is. When you've got somebody like Lebedev, to the Lords.
His title, Lord Lebedev of Hampton and Siberia. I would laugh if it was satire.
Yeah, it's hiding in plain sight. And the people who've been talking about this, the FT has been doing brilliant work for years about this. And as I say, Catherine Belton's book is amazing. The FT has been doing, the Private Eye has been doing brilliant work about this.
They did very well this edition as well.
Yeah.
Scores of stuff. I'm still reading it.
All the stuff that they've written about the Telegraph as well. And you do wonder, but how many people are actually reading that and taking notice and thinking this matters?
I think something is happening in that regard. I'm seeing, definitely from what I've seen on social media and on the news, people who've had close links to Putin are trying to extricate themselves, whether slowly or obviously. They're seeing the way the wind's turning. They're still finding themselves stuck to the wrong people, and they're trying to. It's like the Archipiezas of the 1930s saying in the 1950s, well, I always knew Hitler was evil, but the way I looked at it was if I thought we needed to prepare for war, and we were trying to basically, they're trying to get the excuses in and pretty.
But you've also got, the ones who turn around the sort of Duke of Windsor characters who said, well, I was sounding a perfectly reasonable chap who was up to the workers. But I think what worries me is that it's just too late.
Yeah.
And I think the way that they have used social media, and I think, what we can all see from this, and I think it's something that comes across a bit in the book, is the utter lack of accountability of multi-billionaires.
They do remind me more and more. You mentioned John le Carré. I'm also a bit of a John le Carré fan, but I feel a bit of a fraud to say that because I've never actually read one of his books apart from the 5,000 books. But I've watched a lot of his dramatization. So purely on that basis, I like his work, and I feel like people who say they enjoy Agatha Christie because they watch a film of over Christmas. But but I am reminded. I have been reminded recently of some of. I don't want to draw too much of a comparison for legal reasons. It's just in general about a lack of accountability. Is what I want to touch on very briefly here, and that's Richard Roper in The Night Manager. If you meet him outside his work, and Hugh Laurie did this brilliantly.
He was great.
A very friendly, charismatic individual who, if you didn't know anything about him and you weren't in the probing, questioning mind, you couldn't be blamed for quite liking him and enjoying the company. But then you see that very horrible side that he has not been taken into account from, and it's a few brave people who.
I've seen this with some of these people, and I can't mention names, obviously. But there's sort of mentality that is, and it's a very top public school mentality, where there's complete charm. It's a sort of Machiavellian charm. And true, I've read The Prince and I know my Machiavelli. So I would say it's a Machiavellian psychopath where there is huge charm. They smile as they stick the knife in you, but there is also this utter ruthlessness and this ability to say what they want and demand what they want with a sense of complete control. Have you read any of Mick Herron's books?
No, I
would definitely recommend the Slow Horses, the Slough House books by Mick Herron. He is, to me, the natural successor to Le Carré. They're very different in one way, and I think Gary Oldman has bought them and is now producing a TV series based on them for, I think it might be for Amazon, not 100% sure there. But they are brilliant. They're a great read. And I would say to everybody, read Le Carré. Don't watch TV adaptations, because nothing beats the first time you see Smiley arrive and this slightly shabby, down at heel man. If you want to write, if you're a writer, I always tell people, if you want to understand show, not tell, read Le Carré. He is genius about it. The way he describes, and the first time you meet Smiley, is he describes the state of his cuffs. And it somehow says something, and the way he's holding his body, and it says everything that you see later. He feels like an outsider. He feels like a beaten man.
Which comes
But there's a power about him. It's everything that you see in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. He's a brilliant writer and brilliant for what he gives you in those little glimpses, both of character and story and plot.
Which Guinness did so well.
Is because Guinness is the best.
I know, because if you see him in some scenes, if you met Smiley, you'd feel almost protective. You would feel protective of him, because it seems quite of that. But if you're being interrogated, if I were interrogated by Smiley as played by Guinness, or indeed played by Gary Oldman, I would feel that protective scope. I'd feel nervous and very defensive. It's a very subtle mood.
And it's also that idea that these people are not big personalities. I'm not a fan of James Bond. I'm not a fan of...
I was going to touch on James Bond in a moment.
And if you read the Slow Horses, is what's great. Slough House, they're called Slow Horses because basically these are spies that they can't sack. So what they do is move them sideways into a place where they're going to feel really, where they're going to be modified, boring jobs. So like having to go through all the records of every library about the books being borrowed that could give people information about building bombs. So they have to do that sort of thing. And so it's boring, or looking through all estate agents' records around the country on houses that could be being used as safe houses. So they're mind-numbing, because a lot of spy work is very boring. It's boring admin. And these are people who move sideways, but then he does something very clever and interesting with them. And I'm just thinking about one of the things I love about what Belson's done is she gets to the origins of Putin when he moved out to when he went to East Germany to work. And some of the work was very boring. It's grunt work, but it's portrayed by him all the time as though it's, I was just an administrator. It was very dull. But clearly he was he was involved in compromising diplomats and businessmen and helping build links and get their tentacles into these Western companies as well. And Western companies that when Russia, after post Yeltsin, Western companies that were desperate to get some feel and get some, place in the market, in the Russian market as well. And we're quite naive about it. I mean, it feels like this book is almost about a clash of cultures. That makes sense. It's a sort of, it's how the East, how the West was won. It would be another, it's the way that one society can assume that they are the dominant society. They've won. The end of history, democracy is won, without understanding or accepting or acknowledging fundamental flaws within democracy.
I said
exploited.
And this is totally been subject. I something you touched on reminded me something, and I said I was going to mention James Bond briefly, but not Bond himself. It's the villains in James Bond.
Yeah.
And something you said there reminded me of an argument I once made that Bond villains are actually very nice people. They're sociopathic monsters. Don't ever forget. They don't forget they're sociopathic monsters. But the films or the books. Good evening, Mr. Bond. They're there. He'll have a meal with them. They'll show them around their abode. They'll show this. They'll be all friendly and that. I mean, true, they'll want to kill him in a particularly horrible and grisly way at the end. But I mean, they're polite, they're gracious, they're wonderful. But then, of course, I mean, some people would say that about Putin, but then some are comparing Putin to a Bond villain. And I don't know. And I mean, for the obvious reasons, but then there was a very interesting direct reason. I don't know whether you've heard of this caught this on social media, but in the James Bond film Octopussy, one of the villains is a very disgruntled senior Soviet general, who plans to have an atomic bomb exploded under the guise of a circus thing in a US airbase. So the blame would be that there's been an accidental blow there. The call for disarmament would grow to a crescendo, and he thinks that he would persuade to bring troops across Europe. And the opening scene where you see him at a meeting of the Soviet military head, honchos, and they're aghast as he obviously doesn't tell them plan has got mine, but he's saying, look, the West is decadent and divided. NATO won't counterattack military weapons. We've got this, and this, and we've put it through the Kunststoff computer.
I could not think about it in that way.
Yeah, and you can go across within 5 days. And he's played by Steven Berkoff.
Yeah.
And you've got that shimmer. And the reason it's mentioned lately is everyone's watching it going, Putin. That is Putin. That is Putin to a T. And it's frightening how, you even during the Cold War, if you watched it, you would think, well, that's slightly unrealistic. Whereas now it's like,
I keep thinking of what's it, Dr. Strangelove. Actually, I think it's I go to Kubrick rather than Bond, but
Actually, Kubrick was responsible for the lighting on one of the Bond films because Ken Adam asked him for advice when he was really and said, right, bring me in at 7 a.m. in the morning before anyone arrives. I will have a look round. Don't tell anyone. And Adam only mentioned it and Kubrick's there. And it was the 007 stage, the super tanker and the Spy Love Me. And Kubrick, it was the unofficial lighting consultant, says you need ones there, and you need, So there is a connection. You're saying Dr. Strangelove is, it's, and Ripper always unnerves me slightly.
Yeah.
Some of Peter Sellers, but I mean, for all the way out there, I do think, he had his problems, bless him. And in many ways, he was an awful person, and in many ways, he was a very tortured
I think he was quite a troubled person, wasn't he?
Yeah, Peter Sellers, he was. But I think one of the great tragedies of Sellers is if he had been in a more mentally contained, he could have been a great serious actor as well as a great comedian. And because the moments where you see him as Group Captain Mandrake against Ripper, when you can
Yeah.
see it written across his face, this man is a monster and he is dangerous and I've got to deal with him. And it's all just said in his face and very...
He was a great actor. If you
Yeah.
see him in,
Yeah.
I always remember feeling that he really lost out on the Oscar for being there.
Yes,
Which is a
so do
tremendous
I.
film that people don't watch still.
Yeah.
And also you look at I'm All Right, Jack, which was, I mean, it's an interesting movie. I haven't seen it for quite a long time, but I don't know if you've seen it. But you know, it's one of those films where it's looking at the way the trade unions it's an Ealing comedy in the early 60s, where everybody's out and that control. So in an odd way, it's quite a conservative film, but in other ways it's not, because that hard left conservatism of some of the most, some of the industrial action that went on in the 60s and 70s was actually very conservative, because it was so it was so controlling. But yeah, it's they're well worth it. I mean, he's very good in all of them, but you know, it's a classic thing of he seemed to be seduced by glamour. So it's but yeah, I mean, Being There is a really good film, and it's also about group thing. I mean, maybe that's something that's in his films and quite a lot of his choices, that it's about when people make I mean, Being There, he's this gardener who says something about the seasons and his gardening at a dinner party, and then these ultra rich Manhattanites go, oh my God, you're so wise. You're so wise. And all he said is that the seasons keep changing. Then the spring, then the summer. And he's saying nothing, but they immediately throw their opinion on him. And I think this is something about all of these movements, isn't it? Whether they're political, religious, or whatever, philosophical, is that people seek a guru who will say what they want to say and give them a sense of meaning where perhaps they don't have one. I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and that idea, I'm very comfortable with liminal spaces. I'm comfortable with not knowing. But some people really, really need certainty. They need belief. And you look at the likes of Putin and the division between older Russians and younger Russians, especially. And there is that thing of the need for certainty. I don't know if I've explained that particularly well, but it and I think we saw the same here with Brexit. It was that people need a certainty, people need a scapegoat, people need a group that they can target, or that they can feel explains everything to them that is sometimes unexplainable.
I mean, it could tie into the second part of our discussion quite neatly. I mean, because Russia, one of the things I find sad about Russia in some ways is their love of the strongman, because it's got them into so much trouble. Whereas I always find it interesting they refer to Nicholas II as bloody Nicholas, and yet the worst tyrants, Peter the Great, Stalin, which is Man of Steel, they're almost venerated, which is there. But obviously we're talking about two books here, and I just wanted to talk about the book I was reading, which is one of finished recently, which is Never a Dull Moment, by Jane Ridley, on the life of King George V. And I thought, and one of many biographies of George V, but for some reason I picked it up and it's quite popular, and I read it, and it's the premise of the book, which is in the subtitle, Never a Dull Moment. And I think part of it is she had previously, Jane Ridley, written about King Edward VII, who, whatever one thinks of it, had this racy and exciting life. And George V has always been unfairly compared.
It's a boring one.
But when you look at it, I mean, yes, in many ways there was something, he liked dullness, he liked predictability. He was such a stickler for routine. I mean, one of the reasons his relationships with his children were so bad was he expected them to be like on the representing the committee from birth, and that showed a lack of imagination on his part. But on the other hand, he reigned through from 1910 to 1936. You could hardly say there were dull moments then. You had the First World War. Well, you had the suffragette movement, the constitutional crisis over the Lords. Then you had the
had Ireland,
the Home War, which was about to explode before World War One, and certainly did that during and after World War One. The threat of revolution, the change of a royal house, the general strike, first Labour governments, the Wall Street crash and depression, and he dies whilst everything's going well. It's 6 months after the Silver Jubilee, or 7 months after the Silver Jubilee. You've got the storm clouds of Europe that he was of it was all too aware of. There's an anecdote where one of the last ministerial meetings he ever held, which was just before Christmas 35, a month before he died, and he went to and Sir Anthony Eden went to collect his seals of office as the new Foreign Secretary, because the previous Foreign Secretary, Sir Samuel Hall, had to resign over his approach to Mussolini's invasion to Abyssinia. And George V said, well, I said to your predecessor, as he handed in his seals of office to me, no more coals to Newcastle, no more whores to Paris. The poor fellow didn't even laugh. I mean, and that's something else about George V. I mean, he had his awful side.
Humor, do you?
He had a sense of humor.
We all know about Bugger Bogner.
Which actually apparently is not true. Which
the one thing you thought was interesting about him.
But he hated Bognor Regis. I mean, I can, no disrespect to people of Bognor Regis, but if you're covering from an septicemia, which is just about fatal today, let alone then, and you are down in the dumps, I could think of other more interesting places to recover. But that's no disrespect to Bognor Regis. I've never been there, so if you're watching this and you're living in Bognor, please don't hate me for it. But it's a fascinating book. But I was wondering what do you make of him? What do you think?
When you were describing him, now I'm a teacher now, and I'm dealing with lots of children. I've had lots of training about neurodiversity, and whenever he's described, he's somebody that I've often wondered, was he on the autistic spectrum?
That was crossed my mind just seconds before you said that.
And did you get that sense?
It wouldn't surprise me, and I say this as someone who is slightly on the autistic spectrum.
Oh, I'm definitely on the, well, I'm on the ADHD. I'm sure I have ADHD. So that's why I say neurodiversity, and I do wonder whether that's.
I mean, I'm mildly dyspraxic, so routine, because I can either be hyper organized or I can be hopelessly disorganized. So his love of routine and everything else, I do recognize. His and also this discoloration where he can be highly, highly empathetic. And then on another occasion, it can be so blind and to the point of cruelty. I mean, we talk about the way he treated his children. He was a bit more, I think, easygoing with his youngest son, John, but that was because he knew John was seriously ill with epilepsy and was unlikely to live to adulthood, which tragically he didn't. So John was cut a heck of a lot of slack that perhaps his other children, his eldest son, and the book touches on this, the psychology of it all. His eldest son, the future Edward VIII Duke of Windsor, had it harder than most, which you can understand on one level because he's going to be the next king. So he has got to be perfect in everything. So, but of course, in pushing him, he creates the very situation he's trying to avoid. And she wonders, Jane Ridley, whether part of Edward VIII's behaviour and attitude, which was thrown at him from birth, was in part because he was being pushed, because she said in that situation people were acting both ways. They either kowtow and do everything to please the person responsible, or they will be very rebellious. And he was very rebellious, and
Because they were both quite rigid parents as well. I mean, it's people,
they were,
you know, because Alexandra, she strikes me as being a very rigid.
Queen Mary.
Sorry, Mary. Sorry,
Yeah.
Mary strikes me as being an incredibly rigid
Mm.
parent. But I wonder, the reason I thought of Alexandra, I was thinking about his own parents as well. I mean, what does
Very
she
liberal.
say about Edward,
Yeah.
the seventh, who was less than a Victorian ideal?
He was, I mean, he was pretty much I mean, I was going to say womanizer and the ladies' man. I have wondered on occasion whether some of his, we're looking at it through the views of a Victorian audience, whether some of his mistresses weren't. I mean, obviously he played away from home a great deal,
Yeah.
but I mean, I do wonder whether 2 or 3 of his mistresses, for example, weren't so much mistresses as close female friends.
Yeah.
He confided in.
Yeah.
But of course, you know, obviously, he had a lot of, to put it politely, FWBs, friends with benefits. But I mean, I think he was probably reacting to his strict parenting, you know, and I think, choose most carefully speaking, is, if you're born in a certain, if treated like that,
Yeah.
and women are throwing themselves to you from, you know, you're aware of it from your teenage years onwards. It's I imagine it would be very hard to, you know, say no, or to, if you're in a
celebrity thing, isn't it? You see, it's what we see. I mean, they were the celebrities of their day, weren't they? That every woman would be, you know, tipping her cap. And I think about something like Henry VIII as well. And you think, and it's not just every woman, it's every man will be pushing his wife or daughter or whoever in your direction, because they want a bit of influence, because, you know, they want influence at court. So yeah, that's bound to have a pretty appalling effect on your.
But the fascinating thing was that apparently George V, one of the reasons he was such a stickler for it, he could see the damage growing up caused by his father's behavior. And whilst he loved his father and admired his father and was close friends with his father, he also, to a certain extent, he was in awe of his father. He was determined he wasn't going to be the same, and his children weren't going to be the same. But in his determination, he was behaving the very way his grandparents behaved. So you had this kind of leapfrog of.
So it becomes that classic thing of it sort of going to and fro. And I think, you know, that is the worst thing about you as a parent, isn't it? You try not to be like your parents, but then you can end up
being like your grandparents.
You're always going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
All parents make mistakes. You know, Larkin was right, you know. But people always quote the first line of Larkin, but they don't quote the other lines where they don't know what they're doing, and they don't mean to. But you do wonder, and I look at, you know, our present Queen, who is, I mean, I would say I'm a Republican, but I do have huge admiration for this woman. I think she works hard. She has a huge sense of duty, which is very lacking in public society now, and especially in public professionals now, and a real sense of caring for the country, which is why I do wonder what will happen to this country when she finally goes. I think it's going to be a very, very tricky point, because suddenly all the class resentments, all the other things, all the sense of being pushed down, then it's basically the one thing that stopped people from reacting will have been removed, because she's not there to say, you know, for people to say, yeah, but the Queen, she's great, isn't she? And the rest of them seem to have they don't have the same traction, despite the big PR campaign that's going on with the younger royals now to try and make us feel that they are of the people, etc. But yeah, I do wonder, you know, about that family relationship, though obviously the crown isn't real, sadly. But you know, it feels like the Queen has carried on the same sort of rather strict, rather, you know, with her son, and that's actually not worked in his favour in a modern society. I don't know. Sort
How
of
do you
spraying things out.
how do you rate it, George V as king during the political times he was in? Do you think he was the right person for the right time, or?
Well, he's a very conservative figure. At
Mm.
a time when you had the first Labour government with Ramsay MacDonald, I mean, it's not a period I know huge amounts about. So, but it's also when people were returning from the war. And I don't get a sense of him having any real influence. I remember my grandfather, apparently he used to say that about Edward, Edward, Duke of Windsor, Edward VIII, that he, every taxi driver in London had him in the back of his cab drunk, saying what he was going to do for the working people. And then he made friends with Hitler. And I still think because they lived in this age of deference, when they were demigods, I don't think he had any real conception of the people and any need to actually reward people who'd kept him as king by sacrificing members of their family or even their own lives. So I don't get the sense that he ever stood up for them. He ever said, why isn't this a land fit for heroes? I don't know what it says in there about him, but I don't, I think he's almost an irrelevant king. He's there, but he wasn't a figurehead in the same way.
What I found interesting was he got on better with Labour governments than Conservative governments.
Really, I didn't know that.
Because the Labour governments would be honest with him, but they would treat him with deference.
Yeah.
Whereas Conservative governments would be like, what can we get out of using him for or that was the impression.
Yeah.
He certainly preferred, as in terms as individuals, MacDonald to Baldwin. And it may have rubbed off in some ways because during the general strike, one Conservative minister apparently said to the king, these are Bolshevik revolutionaries, blah, blah, blah. And the king said simply, well, you try living on their wages. So something had clearly gone through
that's very interesting. I didn't know that. As I say, he's not somebody, I mean, it's the fact that we don't really have a sense of him beyond being this austere person who looked a bit like his cousin, who got shot, and so he changed his name. I mean, I think, what does it say about that whole thing with Nicholas?
Oh, no, because that's the big
close, hadn't they?
There was an awful situation, and I'm fairly forgiving of him in this regard because I think we look through hindsight, and you've got to, in order to approach whether he did the right thing, you've got to cut hindsight completely out of the equation, which was he refused an offer of giving his cousin asylum. There were various reasons why he didn't. One of them was Nicholas II and his family were hated by sections of the British population at home. That changed after they were murdered, obviously, because they were seen as martyrs, but they were hated. There were sections of the British government establishment they didn't like. Part of it was that the Tsarina was German, or came from German family, and there was anti-German sentiment in both Russia and in France, really high. So he said no, but I don't. To be two things make me very forgiving of him in this. One was he wasn't to know what was going to happen. There were possibilities of other offers of asylum. Secondly, irrespective of whether he said yes or no, how we know things were in the politics there, the chances of it being able to carry out
have got out,
would have been there, and he would have ended up in that horrible situation in the cellar in the Katerinburg the following year. So there was nothing they could do on that. There was a touching, tragic postscript to this, where in spring of 1919, and this is something else. Ever since after the Tsar and his family were killed, he never, ever, ever made that mistake again. If ever any of his European relatives were remotely in trouble, even if it just seemed a blip, he would send her, and he got his as a
And
result.
how Prince Philip ended up over here.
Yes, that's how, in 1922, when his father
Yeah.
was under sentence of death from the Greek government,
Yeah.
when they realized that he was in a position where they were able to rescue him, so they did, and they got the whole family out. It was 922, and in 1919, and this is the postscript, I was going to say, they got the Tsar's mother, his sister, or one of his sisters, and their families, and via the Mediterranean, the Crimea, where they were, and because it was the Civil War, the Red Army were approaching, via the Mediterranean. And when they arrived, the Grand Duchess Xenia, the older of the Tsar's two sisters, as soon as they saw George V, they thought all the rumours that he'd been shot were clearly untrue, and the Tsar was there, and they all knelt and tried to kiss his hand and everything.
Yeah.
And it was horrifying and tragic, and yet it just showed how, yet again, the fact that they're cousins who look like their brothers, who, to the point where they almost look like, I mean, you can always tell the difference, but they almost look like identical twins.
Yeah. Oh no, they're really, really alike. They look like brothers.
I mean, you can tell the difference because George had these bulbous eyes, where Nicholas's were more narrow.
Yeah.
So you can tell that, but it is quite, and even in our present royals, Prince Michael of Kent, once he grew a beard,
he looks really like him.
Yes, exactly. Both are. Yeah, it's quite. So it just shows how
that's what happens when you have inbreeding in royals.
That I was going to say, because he was very nice, but oh dear, it's.
But cousin marriage, always a bad idea.
It makes you more. I mean, generally, I don't approve of the whole wife mission for a variety of obvious reasons, but I have a lot more sympathy for it in those times. It's like, do you want to marry this second cousin who's your that, or this wealthy mistress and live with her for 30? So.
But that's also, we were talking about Edward VII, but it's all arranged marriages. Of course, there's going to be problems. I mean, I was listening to More Than the Tudors podcast today about Thomas Wyatt, who was the great courtier in Henry VIII's time, as well as the brilliant poet. But he had a terrible, terrible marriage, but it was arranged. He was married, he was married off. All of these marriages are always for sort of social, political reasons. And of course, that means that, you end up with dreadfully unhappy marriages where people don't necessarily stick around and behave as they should. I think in more modern times, it becomes a lot more problematical, which is why there's been a reaction to Charles and Diana, because the royal family had failed to catch up with the idea that everybody didn't care who somebody married, and therefore him marrying this young woman because she was, suitable breeding stock and unsullied was actually a very repulsive thinking for the rest of us.
And also the fact that she had to be a virgin, which
it's repulsive. The whole unsullied thing.
Yeah.
I remember, when I was a teenager thinking, this is repulsive. She's, who's business?
Because I mean, that means if you got to be, they're going to be barely out of their teens. If you want to be absolutely,
he was in his 30s, wasn't he?
Yeah, and which means they're going to get, the older you get and you haven't settled down, the younger and younger the prospect. It's not.
It's horrible.
It is.
It was, it's clearly changed a lot.
I mean, I'm going to get shot down for this from a number of sources. I don't approve of all of what happened. For obvious reasons, but I mean, I could understand on one level why Charles preferred Camilla, because they were personality-wise, they were more suited to each other than
they got a lot more hinterland, as they say, but the idea that how many more years, 60 years, 70 years since the abdication, we were still going through the same idea that a man who, it's just let's face it, it's really a human zoo. Royalty is a human zoo. You're born into captivity. You're never allowed out of the cage. It's a lovely cage. It's got lovely gold bars, and it's got nice sort of places for you to go and live and sleep and do everything else. But it's still a cage. And I mean, it's not an appropriate institution. It's an outdated institution. It's a medieval institution that's trying to operate in a modern world. I mean, it doesn't work. It doesn't work.
What do you think of the third option some talk of, which is an elective monarchy? Almost like the papacy is, where someone gets elected monarch.
Yes, I just call it a precedent. I mean, an elective monarchy, the papacy is kind of not that functional either, as we've seen increasingly.
What's meaning about the way the fact popes are elected and they're more or less till they die, rather than the actual.
Yeah. No, because I think you should always be able to get rid of somebody. I think the idea that you can have somebody in power for the rest of their life is
actually that's a good
worrying. Point. You know, because if you get them in there and they're not appropriate,
then
I just think in this day and age, I think the French have got it right. I think the French do it much better.
I have to say
a lot better. Like they do their legal system a lot better. So it's not it's not so destructively painful to if you're sued as a journalist. You can sort these things out quickly, you know, going back to where we were with Putin and how some of these people have managed to get away with using London as a laundromat, because anybody who tries to report on it is bullied into not writing about it.
Well, as it's St. Patrick's Day, complete coincidence, but as it's St. Patrick's Day, I have to say that I've had the view for a very long while that if Britain was to have a presidency, I would like it based on the Irish model.
The Taoiseach, yeah.
Well, the Taoiseach's the Prime Minister, but the president, two 7-year terms.
Yeah.
And that's it. And usually the Irish presidents seem
they've been
more
great,
amiable. They've been compared to the Taoiseachs like, say, Charles Hockey.
Yeah.
And, you know, they've had amazing people like the fascinating ones like Erskine Childers, who is actually English born.
Yeah.
Father being the author of The Riddle of the Sands. And he was sadly the only one to die in office. And you also have Patrick Hillary and Mary Robinson. So, and even Michael D. Higgins. So you have these incredible characters who some have been in law, some have been politics. It's like people who get made members of the House of Lords. They either come from full-time politics or they come from other walks of life.
Yeah.
But are involved in politics in some way. And it's quite fascinating to see how.
See, this is one of the things I actually think is good about the House of Lords, but I think what's wrong is the way they're paid. And I think having people who've had experience of other walks of life is wonderful. But if you don't pay them and they're not given a proper wage, then what you're inviting are the only people who can actually take those roles, and that becomes billionaires who buy their way in.
Like Baron Lebedev of
what we want of much broader spectrum of ordinary people, but people with good experience within different professions. I'd love to have some teachers in the House of Lords, but anybody even on a teacher's pension, you're not going to be able to do that.
I mean, I did
having people who've had that experience, so that when they're scrutinizing legislation, they're able to say, this is why this wouldn't work. And we don't have that at the moment. We have a bunch of inherited people who haven't got a clue. We've got multimillionaires who have possibly bought their way in, or not necessarily.
I mean,
but they've been given that because of the way that they've supported a party. So they've got it through a form of patronage, and then you've got a few other people, and God knows how they survive.
I mean, I did briefly mention Baron Lebedev. I ought to haste to add allegedly.
Allegedly. I'm not saying he bought his way. I'm not saying any of them, but it's through patronage. It's patronage, and that's not acceptable. It's not acceptable. It's not democratic.
No. Well, An hour's gone past.
Covered a lot of land, haven't
We
we?
have, we have from 20th century to.
Oh, you've frozen. Hello.